The janitor who solved the impossible. The name at the bottom of the stack stopped her cold. Meredith Hale had spent the better part of the morning working through a pile of janitorial applications without really looking up. The candidates blurred together, competent enough, forgettable, interchangeable. But this name she read twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change what was printed on the page. Daniel Foster. She lifted her eyes. Across the reception area sat a man in a jacket that had clearly seen too many winters, his face worn quietly by the years. But that name she had never forgotten. Meredith didn't send someone to fetch him the way she had with the other candidates. She walked out herself, folder in hand, and found him in one of the plastic chairs along the far wall. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't fidgeting. He simply sat with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the floor with the stillness of a man who had long since stopped expecting much from waiting rooms. She said his name. He looked up, no immediate recognition, just a man trying to place someone who clearly already knew him. Then something shifted behind his eyes, slow and careful, like a door opening just enough to let in a single line of light. Meredith, he said. Not a question. Not surprise. Just the word, spoken the way you say the name of something you thought you'd lost. She brought him into her office instead of the standard interview room, a decision made without fully thinking it through, one she chose not to examine too closely. She set the folder on the desk between them and looked at him the way you look at a photograph that doesn't quite match the memory you've carried for years. Daniel Foster had been the kind of student professors still talked about years after he graduated, not because he was loud or competitive, but because his mind made difficult things look almost effortless, like he was simply reading something the rest of the room hadn't learned to see yet. Meredith had sat beside him in advanced calculus during their junior year, quietly failing while everyone else kept pace. Daniel never once made her feel small about it. He explained things the way a good mechanic explains an engine, not to impress you, but to make sure it runs. After graduation, he'd vanished. No forwarding address, no updates through mutual friends. He was simply gone, the way people are sometimes gone when life takes a turn that leaves no room for staying in touch. And now here he was, 42 years old, applying to mop floors. Meredith opened the folder. The application was filled out cleanly, in even handwriting. Under previous employment, warehouse work, night shift inventory, a brief stint with a cleaning company 2 cities over. Under education, simply, Bachelor of Science, Mathematics. No GPA listed, though she remembered it being the kind of number that made department chairs take notice. HR flagged your file, she said, keeping her voice even and professional, because the alternative was sounding like what she actually was. A woman struggling to reconcile 2 completely different pictures of the same man. They said your qualifications were, in their words, excessive for the position. Daniel nodded like this wasn't news. I figured they might. Wasn't sure it'd get past the first screening. It almost didn't. She closed the folder. Why this job? Why janitor? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with the same steadiness he'd always had. The kind that used to make her feel like he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. When he finally answered, there was no performance in his voice, no rehearsed line meant to make the moment easier. I need stable work. No deadlines that move, no politics. Something where I show up, do the job, and know exactly what I'm going home to at the end of the day. He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder than resentment would have. I've had enough of the other kind. Meredith wanted to ask what he meant. What had happened in the 20 years since she'd last seen him? Why a man who could have walked into any graduate program in the country was sitting in her office asking to clean her building? But she knew Daniel well enough to understand he'd only answer what he was ready to answer, and pushing too early would close a door that might otherwise stay open. There's a position in data analysis, she said instead. Entry level on paper, but the work is closer to what you actually know. Pays 3 times what custodial work pays. I can move your file over, no one needs to know it was ever anywhere else. Something crossed his face, not quite gratitude, not quite refusal. He leaned forward and folded his hands the same way he had in the waiting area. I appreciate that. I mean it. But I'd like to take the janitor job, if it's still available. No apology, no defensiveness. I'm not ready for something like that. Not right now. Meredith sat with that for a moment. She'd run a company of 4,000 employees for 6 years. She'd made decisions worth tens of millions of dollars in both directions. She wasn't easily surprised. But something in the quiet certainty of Daniel's voice reached past her professional instincts and landed somewhere more human. She told him the position was still available. Daniel started the following Monday, arriving before the building even opened. Meredith didn't notice this herself at first. She heard it from the overnight security guard, who mentioned it offhand. The way you mentioned something unremarkable. The new janitor was always already there when the guard clocked out, moving through the lobby with his cart like he had nowhere else to be and was perfectly content with that. Quiet, but he nodded when you passed him. The kind of nod that didn't need a response. By the end of his first week, Daniel had reorganized the fourth-floor supply closet in a way that cut restocking time nearly in half. No one had asked him to. The building manager noticed and mentioned it to facilities, who mentioned it to no one in particular, the kind of improvement that quietly made things better without drawing attention to the person responsible. But not everyone was indifferent to Daniel. The operations floor was run by a man named Victor Pruitt, who had been with the company long enough to mistake seniority for authority, and who treated anyone below his pay grade as existing primarily for his convenience. Pruitt spoke loudly in open spaces and kept a running mental ledger of who owed him what. He had a particular way of addressing people he considered beneath him, never quite insulting, but close enough that the intention behind the words was always clear. Within Daniel's first 2 weeks, Pruitt had called him back 3 times to redo floors that didn't need redoing. He'd interrupted him mid-task in front of junior staff to point out a missed corner that hadn't actually been missed. He'd once stopped Daniel in the hallway to complain loudly about the smell of cleaning solution while 2 employees looked on and said nothing. Daniel took all of it without visible reaction. He listened, nodded when appropriate, and went back to work. He didn't file a complaint. He didn't seek Meredith out. He simply absorbed it and moved on, the way water moves around a stone, not because the stone wins, but because moving around it is more efficient than stopping to fight it. Meredith witnessed one of these exchanges herself, passing through the operations floor on her way to check a server installation. She heard Pruitt's voice carrying just enough to be heard, watched Daniel stand with a mop handle in his hands while Pruitt explained, slowly and with exaggerated patience, that a professional would have caught a scuff mark near the elevator before being told. 3 employees pretended to be absorbed in their screens. Daniel looked at the mark, nodded, said he'd take care of it, and turned back toward the elevator without a trace of tension in his shoulders. Pruitt caught Meredith's eye across the room, the brief, uncertain look of a man realizing he'd had an audience he hadn't accounted for, then straightened and walked back to his office. Meredith said nothing that day. But she filed it away in the part of her mind that tracked things requiring attention. The weeks settled into rhythm. Daniel moved through the building like a fixed point, always present, always working, always exactly where he was supposed to be. Employees who'd initially ignored him began nodding when he passed. Paula, the ground floor receptionist who prided herself on remembering every face that came through the door, started leaving a cup of coffee on the utility cart near his supply closet every morning, no explanation given or needed. He'd find it, drink it, and leave the empty cup where she'd see it. Meredith found herself watching him sometimes. Not with the eye of a CEO monitoring performance, but with the particular attention you give something you're trying to understand. He wasn't performing contentment. That was what struck her most. She'd seen people perform it, had done it herself in board meetings and investor calls. Daniel's calm wasn't a performance. It was simply what he'd become. One evening, leaving late, she found him in the lobby wringing out a mop near the entrance. The building was nearly empty. "You're still here," she said. "Few more hallways," he said. She lingered longer than was strictly necessary. "Are you all right?" She wasn't entirely sure what she meant that night, or in general, or across the whole 20-year gap that sat between them like a distance she could see but not measure. He looked at her with that same steady attention. "Yeah. I'm all right." No qualification. Which was either the most honest answer she'd heard in months, or the most carefully guarded one. She couldn't quite tell which. She said goodnight and walked to her car. In the reflection of the glass doors behind her, she could still see him working, unhurried and exact. She sat in her car a moment before starting the engine, thinking back to the last time she'd seen Daniel Foster, both of them 22, standing outside the mathematics building on the last day of finals. He'd helped her pass a course she'd been failing since October. She'd thanked him, he'd shrugged it off, said something about how the proof was already in her head and he'd just helped her find it. Then he'd walked away across the quad, and she had assumed, the way you assume things at 22, that she'd see him again, that paths like his didn't simply disappear. She'd been wrong. Now she pulled out of the parking lot carrying a question she couldn't set aside any longer. Something had happened to Daniel Foster. Something had bent a trajectory that should have led to a doctoral program, a research career, a life built around the thing he did best, bent it all the way down to a mop and a supply closet. She didn't know what yet. But she intended to find out if the crisis arrived on a Thursday, the way most tech crises do, quiet, then all at once. A flag appeared in the monitoring system at 6 in the morning, dismissed by the overnight team as routine. By 9, the anomaly had spread into the core processing layer of the company's flagship logistics algorithm. By 11, the engineering leads were crowded into the 7th-floor conference room, laptops open, faces arranged in the specific expression that means things are worse than anyone saying out loud. Meredith arrived at 11:15 to find her technical director, a sharp, generally unflappable man named Adrian Kessler, explaining that the algorithm governing distribution for 3 of their largest clients had developed a cascading error in its optimization function. Not catastrophic yet, but progressing. Left uncorrected for a few more hours, it would begin generating faulty routing data, and at their scale, that meant hundreds of millions of dollars in contractual exposure. Kessler's team had been on it since 7. They'd found where the error was expressing itself, but not its source, the exact point in the algorithm's logic where the optimization had broken down, buried somewhere in a sequence none of them had been able to isolate. The whiteboard at the end of the room was a mess of branching formulas, arrows, and 3 colors of marker tracing 3 failed approaches. Daniel came in at 11:40. Not supposed to be in the conference room at all, only cleaning the hallway outside it as part of his Thursday rotation. Someone had propped the door open with a chair for foot traffic to the server closet, and he'd worked his way down the hall until he was standing in the doorway, about to move the chair and shut the door so he could finish the floor. He didn't move the chair. He stood there and looked at the whiteboard. No one noticed him at first. The room was too absorbed in its own pressure. He watched for what must have been 90 seconds, long enough for Meredith, standing near the back wall with a tablet, to catch him in her peripheral vision and look up. He wasn't reading the board the way a curious passerby reads something unfamiliar. He was reading it the way you read something you recognize, checking whether what's in front of you matches what you already know to be true. Meredith didn't call across the room. She waited. Daniel turned and found her eyes without searching for them, a silent question in his expression, a man who's seen something and is trying to decide whether it's his place to say so. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He crossed to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, found a clear patch of space in the bottom right corner, and wrote. Not slowly, not with any flourish meant to demonstrate intelligence. He wrote the way you write when the answer is already formed and your hand is simply catching up to your mind. 7 lines of calculation, clean and tight, ending in a single bracketed expression that isolated the exact point of failure. He set the marker down and stepped back. One of the junior engineers, a young man named Noah Ellis who hadn't yet learned to hide his reactions, looked at the board and blurted, "Who wrote that?" The room turned. Kessler ended his call. Someone gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. The man standing by the whiteboard was in a gray uniform with a company logo on the chest, mop cart parked by the door. "I might be wrong," Daniel said, plainly, in the same tone he might use to mention the soap dispenser on the 3rd floor was running low. "But if the error's in the waiting function, that's where I'd look." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something has happened that nobody has a script for. Kessler walked to the board and studied Daniel's 7 lines for a long moment, ran something on his phone, and watched his own expression move through skepticism, attention, recognition, and finally the look of a man who's just watched someone walk up to a locked door and open it without a key. "Run it," he said to the room, still looking at the board. They ran it. 11 minutes later, the error flag cleared. The algorithm resumed normal function. The cascading failure stopped exactly where it was and progressed no further. No one said anything to Daniel directly. He retrieved his cart from the door, finished the hallway, and moved on to the next section of his rotation. By the time the room had settled into the relief of the crisis being over, he was already 2 floors down. Meredith found him that afternoon near the service elevator on the 5th floor. She let a beat of silence pass before she spoke. "Some things need space before they can be said without sounding transactional." "Where did that come from?" Daniel set his cart against the wall. "I've had a lot of time to think," he said. "When you're doing work that doesn't take everything you have, your mind goes somewhere. Mine usually goes back to math." He said it plainly, without trying to make it sound profound. "What happened to you, Daniel?" "After graduation. I need to understand." He was quiet for a few seconds. Not evasive, just organizing his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried no performance, no rehearsed tragedy for an audience. His parents had gotten sick within 2 years of each other. His father first, a slow illness requiring constant care that drained the family's savings faster than anyone had planned for. Daniel had already been accepted into a fully funded doctoral program in applied mathematics at a university in the Northeast. He deferred once, then again, and then the window closed and the program moved on without him. His mother's illness followed. By the time both were gone, Daniel was in his early 30s with a resume gap no hiring manager in his field wanted to look at directly. He'd taken whatever work he could find, logistics, warehousing, anything that paid consistently. Every time he tried to move back towards something closer to his training, the gap came up, or his age came up, or the market had shifted and the entry points had closed. After enough years of that, you stop spending energy on doors that don't open and start focusing on what's actually available. He looked at her. "I don't tell people this because I want sympathy. I made the choices I made because they were the right ones at the time. I'd make them again." "You could have called someone," Meredith said. "You could have called me. You had your own life to build. I wasn't going to show up at someone's door with my problems." She wanted to argue. She didn't. Arguing would have been about making herself feel better, not about anything useful to him. Instead, "That wasn't your decision to make for me." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "Maybe not." She left it there. But walking back to the elevator, she found herself thinking about the doctoral program he'd deferred, the research career that never happened, and the mind that had been quietly, steadily running calculations through whatever quiet hours a warehouse job or a night shift allowed, because some things don't switch off no matter what the rest of a life looks like. Word of the conference room traveled the way things travel in office buildings. Not through official channels, but through the informal network of people who'd been in the room, and people who'd heard from people who'd been in the room. By the end of the day, enough of the right people knew that a janitor had walked into a room full of engineers and solved, in minutes, a problem they'd been stuck on for 6 hours. Victor Pruitt heard before 5 o'clock. He was in Meredith's office by 5:15, arms crossed, explaining in the tone of someone who'd rehearsed his lines that what had happened was a serious breach of protocol, an hourly custodial employee engaging directly with proprietary technical infrastructure, without authorization from anyone in the management chain. He used the word liability twice, precedent once, and made clear he believed the matter required a formal response directed at the employee who'd caused it. Meredith let him finish without interrupting. Then she asked one question: had the algorithm been fixed? Pruitt said that was beside the point. "It's exactly the point," she said, in the tone that ends a conversation. "I'll look into the matter." Pruitt left. Meredith sat at her desk a long time afterward. She recognized what he was doing. She'd seen it before, in companies she'd worked at before starting her own. The particular institutional defensiveness that flares up when someone outside the designated hierarchy does something the hierarchy couldn't. It was never really about protocol. It was about the fact that a man who mopped floors had solved a problem a room full of credentialed engineers hadn't, and that kind of disruption threatened certain people more than any system failure ever could. She wasn't going to let it go quietly. But she also knew she wasn't the only voice that mattered when board members got involved. 3 days later, 2 of them contacted her directly, briefed, she suspected, by someone who'd framed it as a security issue rather than what it actually was. They used careful, distant language, but the message underneath was clear: the situation needed resolving in a way that protected the company's formal structures. Meredith drafted a response, deleted it, and started over. The first version said too much of what she felt and not enough of what she needed to say strategically. The second version was measured and professional, focused on outcomes. But even sending it, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The board had a position. Pruitt had framed the narrative. And Daniel, who had done nothing but see something clearly and offer it without being asked, was now at the center of a problem he hadn't created. She was still at her desk at 8 that evening when her assistant forwarded a message from HR. Daniel Foster had submitted his resignation, effective immediately. No grievance cited, no complaint, just a single line saying he appreciated the opportunity and wished the company well. Meredith read it twice. Then she walked down to the 4th-floor supply closet, where Daniel's cart still stood, his thermos and work gloves beside it, and a small notebook sealed neatly in a plastic bag. He was gone. He hadn't told her he was leaving. He'd simply decided, in the same quiet, deliberate way he decided most things, that leaving was the cleanest solution, that his presence had become a problem for her, and removing himself was the most direct way to fix it. She stood in the hallway a long time. The building was nearly empty, the fluorescent light above the door humming. She had lost him once, 20 years ago, without ever understanding how. She had built something she was proud of in the years since, and had never entirely stopped carrying, somewhere in the back of her mind, a question about where Daniel Foster had gone and what had become of the particular quality of mind she'd once watched at work in a calculus classroom, back when they were both young enough to believe that talent alone determined where a person ended up. Now she knew the answer. And he was gone again, this time, in front of her. She gathered the thermos, the gloves, and the notebook and carried them the way you carry something belonging to a person you're not ready to let become a memory again. She didn't open the notebook that night. She set it on her kitchen counter with the thermos and gloves, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the table doing nothing in particular for a long time. She opened it the next morning before work. The first several pages were what she might have expected. Equations, mostly the kind that fill margins when a mind has nowhere else to put itself. Some were clearly connected to his current work: optimization problems, sequencing logic, probability chains that resembled the architecture underlying the company's own systems. He hadn't been working from any proprietary documents. He'd arrived at the same conclusions from his own thinking, by a different road. The way two people can walk toward the same city from opposite directions and meet in the middle without ever planning it. But it was the later pages that stopped her. Toward the back, the equations gave way to something else: shorter entries in the same clean hand, addressed to no one. He wrote about his father's last months, about the particular exhaustion of being the only person in a situation and knowing that exhaustion wasn't an excuse to stop. He wrote about a job he'd lost at 37, not from failure but because the company restructured and gave his role to someone 15 years younger and $20,000 cheaper. He wrote about the doctoral program he'd deferred, not with regret exactly, but with the clear-eyed accounting of someone trying to understand their own life rather than mourn it. Near the last written page, he'd copied down a single line. The same one he'd said to her outside the supply closet weeks earlier. Not everyone who takes the long way around is lost. Meredith closed the notebook and sat with her hands flat on the cover, looking at nothing. Then she got up, got her coat, and went to find him. She didn't have his address through the company. He'd listed a P.O. box on his paperwork, which she hadn't thought twice about at the time. She went through the HR system herself, overriding 2 layers of access protocol without much concern for the record it would leave, and found an emergency contact form with a handwritten address: a building on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood that had been declining for 20 years and hadn't yet found its way back. She drove there herself, without calling ahead. The buzzer panel had several names in faded marker and several blank slots. Daniel's name was there. Third floor, written in the same clean hand as the notebook. He answered after a few seconds. A long beat of silence, then he said her name, just her name, nothing attached to it, and buzzed her in. His apartment was small and orderly, a single room serving as living space and kitchen, a narrow window facing the building across the street, books stacked in even columns against one wall. A legal pad sat on the table by the window, covered in the same kind of notation she'd seen in the notebook. He'd been working when she arrived, or thinking, which for Daniel was often the same thing. He offered her the chair and sat on the edge of the bed across from her, and they looked at each other the way two people look at each other when a great deal needs to be said and neither is quite sure where to begin. Meredith set the notebook on the table between them. She didn't explain how she'd come to read it, he already understood, and didn't seem to mind. He looked at it for a moment, then back at her. "The project's stalled," she said. "Kessler's team has been working off what you put on the board, but they hit another wall 2 days ago. Your solution was correct, it was just one layer of the problem. There are 2 more underneath it." She said it plainly, because Daniel never needed things softened. "I need you to come back." He was quiet. Outside, a truck moved slowly down the street below the window. "Meredith. I know how it ended. I know what happened with the board, and with Pruitt. I know you left to make it easier for me, which I didn't ask you to do, and which I'm telling you now wasn't necessary." She kept her voice level, this wasn't a speech, and she didn't want it to sound like one. "I'm not asking you to come back as a janitor. I'm asking you to come back as an internal problem-solving consultant. You'd work with the engineering teams on methodology. No big title, no corner office. You'd be treated the same as every other employee, which is something I should have enforced better the first time." Daniel looked at the legal pad and turned it face down with one hand, an automatic gesture, as if he didn't want the work in progress pulled into the conversation. "What about the board?" "I handled the board." "What does that mean?" "It means I went into a meeting and explained, in terms they couldn't reasonably object to, that a janitor with no current credentials had written the solution to a critical system failure, a solution a room full of engineers with advanced degrees had spent 6 hours failing to find. And that any company that responds to that by removing the person responsible isn't managing its assets intelligently." She let that sit. 2 of them pushed back. "I told them I'd be happy to schedule a follow-up meeting once they'd found someone else who could do what you did." That ended the conversation. Something moved across Daniel's face, not quite amusement, not quite disbelief. He looked at her the way you look at someone who's just done something you wouldn't have predicted, even from a person you knew well. "And Pruitt?" "Victor Pruitt is no longer with the company. That decision was mine, and I made it. And I would have made it regardless of what happened in that conference room. What I watched him do to you over 6 weeks was enough on its own." She said it without heat, because heat would have made it sound like vindication, and it wasn't. It was a correction that should have come sooner. "I'm sorry it didn't." Daniel was quiet for a long time, looking at the flat gray light through the window. "I'm not looking for a redemption arc," he said finally, without irony. A plain statement of where he stood, not a rejection of her offer. "I'm not interested in being someone's story about how talent always finds a way. That's not what I am. I know. That's not what I'm asking you to be." "Then what are you asking?" "I'm asking you to come into a building full of people who are very good at certain things and completely unable to think outside of them and spend some time with them. Not to fix them. Just to show them a different way of approaching a problem." She kept it simple, because the simple version was the true version. "You've been doing that your whole life. You did it for me in a calculus classroom 20 years ago. The only difference now is that I can actually pay you for it." Daniel looked at the notebook on the table, reached out, and turned it right side up again, studying the cover the way you look at something you've carried so long you've stopped seeing it clearly. "No title," he said. "Consultant," she said. "Internal. Whatever the business card says, the actual function is what I described. No separate office. There's a room on the third floor, used to be a secondary conference space, been storage for 2 years. We'll clear it out. He went quiet again, and she let him be quiet, because Daniel had always needed the room to think that most people tried to fill with talking. All right, he said. Not a dramatic concession. Just a decision made the same deliberate way he made most decisions, with the minimum necessary words and none of the performance. Meredith picked up the notebook and held it out to him. He took it. She told him the paperwork would be ready by the end of the week, and that she'd address the full staff before he started, because she wasn't going to let him walk back into that building without everyone in it understanding what had happened and why. He said that wasn't necessary. She said it was, and that it wasn't up for negotiation, which pulled the corner of his mouth into something that wasn't quite a smile, but had its shape. She stood to leave. At the door, she stopped. Daniel. He looked at her from across the small room. You said something to me once, in the hallway outside the supply closet, about not everyone who takes the long way around being lost. She held his gaze. I read it in the notebook, too. I want you to know I think about it. It's one of the truest things I've heard in a long time. Daniel looked at her steadily. Took me a while to believe it myself. She left him there with the legal pad and the notebook and the flat gray light, and drove back to the office with the particular clarity that comes after a decision has been made and all that's left is to follow through. She called a full staff meeting for the following Monday morning. Standing at the front of the main floor with 400 people arranged in front of her, some in chairs, some along the walls, she told them plainly what had happened with the algorithm failure, without softening the part where her own engineering team had been unable to find the answer. She told them that a man working as a janitor in their building had walked past an open door and written down a solution that stopped a cascading system failure before it reached the point of no return. She told them that the company's response, treating it as a liability instead of a gift, had been wrong, and that she intended to address it directly, starting with the fact that the man most responsible for turning the situation into a disciplinary matter no longer worked there. She didn't name Pruitt. She didn't need to. The people who needed to understand, understood. She told them Daniel Foster would be returning. Not as a janitor, but as a consultant in problem-solving and analytical thinking, and that she expected him treated with the same respect as anyone else who worked there. She said it clearly, without turning it into a lecture, because she didn't want the message to be about shame. She wanted it to be about correction. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping. She couldn't see who, from where she stood. The sound moved through the space the way sound moves when it means something. Daniel started on a Wednesday. He came through the front entrance, and Paula handed him a visitor badge and told him his room was ready on the third floor. He thanked her by name and took the elevator up. The room had been cleared over the weekend, a whiteboard on the far wall, a table, for chairs, a window looking out over the street. Daniel set his notebook on the table and stood in front of the whiteboard for a moment, looking at its blankness the way you look at something waiting to become useful. He uncapped a marker. Wrote nothing for a moment. Then wrote a single equation at the top of the board, not a solution, just a starting point, and stepped back to look at it. Something in his face settled into the particular quiet of a person who was exactly where they're supposed to be, even if the road that got them there made no sense to anyone who only saw the destination. The mop was gone from the building. But he'd kept it, standing in the storage closet of his apartment on the east side of the city, behind the door, the kind of place you'd put something you're not finished with. Not a reminder of what he'd lost, but of the distance he'd crossed to get from there to here, and of every quiet, unhurried step it had taken to make the crossing.